Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talk Now Radio. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man. And I want to remind everybody real quick that we are no longer Paranormal Palace Radio. We are now Talk Now. I've done this here because I plan on covering a whole wider range of topics and getting away from things that aren't just paranormal, but covering sports, entertainment, a lot of other things, just to give a broader range. So I thought Talk Now was a little bit more appropriate. If you guys got any questions you want to call in and ask, the number's 832-632-7904. And today we're going to be interviewing Laird Scranton. We're going to talk about his book, the Velikovsky Heresies. And I know I'm botching that word, and I let him correct me on that. And if we got time, we're going to talk about his other book about the Doggin tribe, which they got their own story that I'm a little bit familiar with. And I believe Robert Temple has interviewed them before, too, if I'm not mistaken. And they were visited by ancient astronauts at a certain point in time in the past who taught them about astronomy and other things. But we can get into that after we get to touch bases on his other book, that the original one we're here to talk about. If you want to learn more about him, you can go to www.redroom.com /member/Laird-Scranton, and he's got a whole page there. And Laird, do you have another page somewhere else?
Well, there is a LairdScranton.com website that I actually don't manage. Someone put it up, and it does have information about my books and a way to contact me and things like that. But it's not actually my site.
Oh, so somebody was supporting you because they liked your work.
Yes.
Well, that happens a lot. I think somebody was doing that for Nick Redfern for a while, too. Now, this book about the, is that pronounced Velikovsky?
Yes, it's Velikovsky Heresies.
Okay, so that V is kind of silent.
That's right, it sort of is. The man, Immanuel Velikovsky, was a friend and colleague of Albert Einstein's back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And he was Russian-born, and so Velikovsky is a Russian name.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure, because the part that kept giving me all that trouble is that V right before that sky, or ski.
Uh-huh.
It's kind of hard to try to pronounce that unless that V is silent. So, yeah, we got that. Now, as I understand, this book has to deal, and I haven't read it myself, so you're going to have to fill in some of the gaps, with the planet Venus, and it wasn't always in the orbit it's in now, if I understand correctly?
Well, Velikovsky in 1950 published a highly controversial book called Worlds in Collision. And he really didn't originally plan to write a book about astronomy, but he was researching a book about history at Columbia University, ancient Egyptian history, and came across a papyrus that seemed to describe historical events in Egypt that sounded like the 10 plagues. And so this excited him because he thought, well, that means there's a historical rationale for the biblical story. And he began to research that and realized that the kind of calamity that was being described in Egypt wouldn't have been just a local calamity, it would have been a global calamity. So he then started looking at other cultures from the same time and writings they had, and to try to see if anybody else was reporting the same types of effects. And he discovered that they all were about that same time. And they all described a similar cause for the great upheaval that happened. They were all assigning the blame.
I got a hunch about that already.
They were assigning the blame.
Listening to you, it sounds to me like you're leading to a planet that could have caused the gravitational pull on our planet could have caused a red tide effect that was global.
Right. I mean, some of the effects that are being described in Egypt can be attributed to all the volcanic eruptions that were happening at the time, because a lot of similar things happen in other eruptions. Like when Mount St. Helens erupted, there were boils on the skins of the people who were downwind of the ash. And if there's the right chemical composition in the ash, it can turn rivers red, and it can cause vermin around the rivers to abandon the river if it becomes poisoned. And there are all sorts of things that can be attributed to the volcano. But there were other effects that make it look like something much larger than just that was happening, that the volcanoes themselves were a reaction to something. Now, when Velikovsky got into looking at these texts, all these different cultures were saying that it was a comet that caused the problem, that a comet made a close approach to the Earth. And the problem was that the names that these cultures gave to the comet, they were different from culture to culture, but in every case, whatever name was assigned to the comet later on was the same name assigned to the planet Venus. And Velikovsky said, well, that looks to me like we've got corroborated testimony here that the comet became Venus. And so he started doing more research and went back in time and noticed that all the earliest words and references to the planet Venus were all given in terms of comets, pictures that looked like comets and descriptions that sound like comets. And so Velikovsky came up with a theory that Venus had to be a relatively recent addition to the family of planets. If you go to the ancient mythology of any culture, Velikovsky says it's always easy to find the mythological character who represents Venus because it's the goddess who's born into the myth. And there's a myth in an ancient Greek myth that says that Venus was ejected from Jupiter. And so Velikovsky came up with a scenario where he was suggesting that a large body had smashed into Jupiter and Venus was ejected, and at first was a brilliant comet that roamed the solar system, creating all sorts of havoc. It was so bright in the beginning that the ancient cultures didn't realize it was a planet. They all grouped it with the sun and the moon because it was so bright. They could see it move across the sky in the daytime. And all these cultures had 4-planet systems originally, and then eventually Venus was added to the system. So Velikovsky published this very controversial book back in 1950 that was a runaway bestseller, but it really upset the scientists. So much so that the lead astronomer at Harvard University organized a boycott of the publisher's textbook division to try to arm twist them into to not publishing Velikovsky's book.
Well, I can see why it would cause a controversy. I mean, if what you're saying is true, then, and he was right about his theory, well, a red tide, like what caused Egypt's 10 plagues, was something that happened globally. It's no longer God was getting retribution on Egypt and rescuing his people out of there. This is a global event. I'm pretty sure there's parties out there that wouldn't want that part to, have to contend with.
Yeah, there's all sorts of aspects to it that are upsetting to religious people and scientific people besides. In science, the problem is if you start supposing that Venus isn't billions of years old, that sort of undercuts the foundations of astronomy. Our system of astronomy is presuming that all the planets formed at the same time. And our theories of planet formation require them all to have formed at the same time. And so if Venus didn't, then that's a monkey wrench in the works of the astronomers.
So this one book by itself could have stepped on 2 institutions' toes, at least, if not more.
That's right. Now, Velikovsky also upset people because he crossed the boundaries of different disciplines. I mean, he himself was trained as a psychiatrist and he wrote as a historian. But here he was offering up what was essentially an astronomic theory, but he was using ancient mythology and ancient texts to justify an astronomic theory. And the astronomers didn't know what to do with that. I mean, they're not prepared to answer an argument that's based on ancient myths. As far as the astronomers were concerned, ancient myths aren't any better, hardly any better than fairy tales.
Well, I take it since you're revisiting his work, you probably added your own angle to it. Like you probably, instead of just going off of mythology, you've probably taken some kind of archaeology or some other scientific approach to add to the case to bolster it up some?
Well, yes. What I've done is, the problem with Velikovsky's theory is that it's been 60 years since his book was published, And during that time, there are still many open questions about was he or was he not right about certain aspects of it. And you would think that over the course of 60 years they could prove or disprove each of those points. But there are so many open questions that I thought, well, maybe if we examined all the science that's happened since Velikovsky died in 1979, we might be able to come up with a definitive answer here. Could he, some fact that would require him to be wrong or some fact that would suggest that he probably is right. And so I started writing the book and researching the book from that perspective. I was trying to find some new fact that was not available to Velikovsky that would tip the scale on the argument.
And since 79, there should have been.
Right, and there have been all sorts of probes now that have been sent out to Jupiter and to Venus and to Mars and to study comets. And so there was all sorts of new science. It seemed like a perfect time to sit down and say, now, how does Velikovsky hold up against all this new science? So what I did basically was I took the scenario that Velikovsky paints, and it has several different phases to it, and at each stage of his scenario, I basically asked the question: does the new science, I was trying to do the same thing as when you vet a suspect in a murder case. You bring the guy in, the police bring the guy in, and they say, where were you the night of Saturday the 19th between the hours of 8 and 10 p.m.? Now, if you have a logical explanation for where you were during those times, then they know you couldn't be the murderer, and so you go on your way. Well, that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to find, is there a reason that we can just dismiss Velikovsky's theory at any of these stages based on what we know? And what I found out was there isn't. You can't dismiss it. At each stage, there's at least a half a dozen considerations that would all go away if Velikovsky's right, and that all have to be somehow explained away if Velikovsky's wrong. And that doesn't sound to me like a theory that's wrong. That's the way a theory that's right works.
Right. So you was able to kind of at least verify to your own satisfaction that the man was onto something.
Well, or at least that there's something there that needs to be examined, because there are just far too many questions connected with what he said that don't have adequate resolution right now after 60 years. And that shouldn't be the case. If the astronomers are right, then they ought to be able to point to a single fact that shows that Velikovsky can't be right. Like when you go to Venus itself, there are all sorts of things about the planet Venus that make it look like a young planet. It's very, very hot compared to the other planets. It has a pristine surface compared to the other planets. And it has an unusual rotation and revolution around the sun compared to the other planets. There are all these different facts about Venus that make it look like it wasn't formed in the same way or at the same time as the other planets.
Well, it's not really hard to believe this here happening. I mean, I think there have been other reported cases where similar has occurred. It's not like we're in a no-hit zone. I mean, yeah, Jupiter catches a lot of the hits out there, but it doesn't catch them all.
No, it doesn't. And one of the studies I came across, there was a Chinese study done trying to explain why the core of Jupiter is half the size it should be and intensely hot, hotter than it should be. And so what this set of computer simulations suggested was that a body 10 times the size of the Earth smashed into Jupiter at some point and vaporized its core. Now that's just the kind of event that would have generated enough energy to have ejected a planet like Venus. And it's also a similar kind of event to what's described in the Greek myth. In the Greek myth, there's a goddess named Metis who is prophesied to have a baby that's going to be even greater than Jupiter. It's actually Zeus in Greek. And so in order to prevent that, the god who plays Jupiter ends up swallowing Metis, and then Venus is ejected from the head of Jupiter. And so that's pretty much the same scenario that Velikovsky is talking about. So then you look, there are all sorts of things you can track from that point on to try to see whether this makes sense or not. I mean, there are moons orbiting Jupiter that should have been disturbed by this if it actually happened, and there are all sorts of questions at each stage of the game that you can examine. Well, for example, back when at the time of the 10 plagues, I already mentioned that that's a very active geologically volcanic time, and they don't have an explanation for why it was suddenly so active. But there's also a major fluctuation in the magnetic field that happens that they can't explain, and there's climate change that happens that they can't explain, and other situations from a scientific standpoint that, if Velikovsky's right, we have a single cause that can explain all these things happening at the same time. And if he's wrong, then suddenly they have to come up with individual explanations for why all these things coincidentally make it look like he's right.
Right. Well, what exactly do the probes that they've been sending out in space tell us to either confirm or unconfirm any of this?
Okay, well, the most recent probe that's been to Venus is called Venus Express, and it was sent out by the European Space Agency. And it's discovered all sorts of things about Venus. For one thing, it turns out Venus actually has a remnant tail that's a lot like a comet's tail. It's not visible now, but when they've done studies of these exosolar systems recently, they have seen planets that have tails that look like a comet. So it's not unthinkable that a planet could have had one. And this tail that's on Venus, every time Venus and the Earth come to the closest points in their orbit, this tail reaches out into space. It extends millions of miles out into space, and it points right towards the Earth. And Venus always turns its same face to the Earth at that point, the same way the Moon always turns its same face to the Earth. All of this suggests that there might have been a close approach between the two. There's a kind of apparent resonance there between the two bodies that could be the result of them having been in close contact with each other before.
Close proximity, yeah. And does it really matter if modern day astronomers delve into this further or not, or if they just go ahead and go with the old story and overlook it? I mean, is it going to make a difference in our world in some way, shape, or form, or?
Well, it is, and it's getting harder and harder for them to prop up the official storyline, because I have a friend, there's a guy named, an astronomer by the name of Jeff Marcy, who is an astronomer with Berkeley, at Berkeley in California. And he's the guy who leads the search for Earth-like planets. You might have seen an article in the last couple of weeks about they discovered the two most Earth-like planets so far were discovered recently, and that was his team that came up with those. And he says that his studies of these other solar systems flatly contradict the two theories that we have for planet formation, that our theories of planet formation can't be right based on what he sees. And so that leaves us without a real working theory for how the planets even formed. So Velikovsky's scenario suggests that these gas giant planets are somehow involved with the formation of planets. So one of the questions I asked of Jeff Marcy was, does he know of any planetary system out there that doesn't include a gas giant? He says, actually no, that they can't rule out the existence of gas giants in every single one or in any of the solar systems they've studied. As a matter of fact, there have been situations where they have theorized that the planets that are in these solar systems were originally part of a gas giant, and a gas giant that split to form a couple of planets.
So we could have just as well got a close flyby from a planet or comet, a planet-sized comet, before Venus ever come through from out of our solar system.
Right. I mean, one of the theories for how our planets formed was that the planets coalesced from basically the gas cloud that surrounded the sun when it formed, the gas ring. The ring of materials, primordial material that was there. Another theory is that another sun-sized body made a close approach to our sun as it was forming and sort of pulled off some material that, like little droplets, and the droplets turned into planets. But neither of those theories hold up to what they see existing in these other solar systems. So if we're looking for a theory anyway as to how planets form, Velikovsky's suggestion is as good as anybody else's right now, or it seems to me it should be.
Well, it doesn't sound at all impossible to me, and I wouldn't see why anybody would want to reject it out of hand, except I know, religion and science both have a tendency to want to stick to a already pre-established dogma, in other words.
Right. People get invested in their theories, and there are careers at stake, and there is public reputation at stake, and so forth. But if you think about it, the official astronomic theory for how our moon formed is that something smacked into the Earth and knocked off material that became the moon. Now, if that can happen on a small scale on the size of a moon, why is it unreasonable to say that it happened on a larger scale on the scale of a planet?
Yeah, plus I've also heard the theory that at one point we were hit by our moon, and that that's what formed the Pacific Ocean, and some of the debris that got shot out of that Earth at that point became the asteroid belt. I don't know if you heard of that one or not.
Yeah, I've heard lots of different suggestions. Now, there's some other complications to this. For example, they've done studies they've actually sent craft out to look at comets and take samples of what the comets are made of, and they have a better idea now of the composition of these things. And one of the surprises that came out of that was that there's a real, what they call a zoo of material, a real mix of different kinds of materials that make up comets. And these are materials that if you go with the official theory that these comets have been around since the solar system first formed, that means you've got material that formed very, very, very close to the sun that somehow had to be intermingled with material that formed very, very, very far away from the sun. And they don't have a mechanism for how this material got together or intermixed or coalesced to form the comet. But if you go to a gas giant like Jupiter, most astronomers these days consider the atmosphere of Jupiter to be a pristine sample of that original cloud. So anything that could be produced by that original cloud of material could also theoretically be produced from the atmosphere of Jupiter. And as you go down in the descending levels of Jupiter's atmosphere and your pressure gets greater and greater and greater and greater, you have all sorts of different kinds of materials theoretically being formed. And you've got gigantic swirling storms like the giant red spot on Jupiter that are capable of intermixing this stuff. And so doesn't it make sense that at least short period comets, which tend to gravitate towards Jupiter, might have formed inside Jupiter and been ejected rather than captured by Jupiter?
Well, if all this is going on, that would seem to indicate to me, and I'm no scientist, don't get me wrong, but if this is happening, shouldn't Jupiter be growing and growing and growing over time?
Well, no, there's not really enough incoming material to make Jupiter grow. I mean, Jupiter is huge. It's like a 50. I think it's the equivalent of all the other planets combined, maybe 50 times the size of the Earth. But if it gets hit by objects, those objects are just a drop in the bucket compared to the size of Jupiter. So I don't think they would see it grow appreciably.
We could use a planet that size to live on.
So basically what I do in my book is I follow along Velikovsky's scenario, and at every stage I try to ask these questions. Is there a fact, there are many points at which if a single fact goes against him, large pieces of his scenario fall down. For example, Velikovsky is saying that around 750 BC, Venus had whacked into Mars, had made a direct impact on Mars, and Mars made a close approach to the Earth. And shortly after that, all the cultures of the planet that had for thousands of years had a 360-day year suddenly changed to a 365-day year. Velikovsky is saying that the reason that happened is because the length of the year was actually increased. The Egyptologists are saying that's not true. There never was a 360-day year. That was just a ceremonial year. And there never was a change like that. But I approached my friend John Anthony West, the Egyptologist, who I know is in contact with a lot of Egyptian scholars, and I said, could you please ask them to provide us with one single fact, one irrefutable fact that says that Egypt had to have a 365-day year back in ancient times. And it turns out there isn't a fact, that all the evidence that the 365-day year is based on is ambiguous evidence. It can be interpreted one way to support a 365-day year, or it can be interpreted another way to support a 360-day year. And so I did research into other areas to say, could there have been a change in the length of the year? Well, one of the signs that there was is that they have computer programs that calculate backwards in time when the eclipses were. You know, if the rotation of the Earth and the sun and so forth and the moon are like clockwork, which is what the scientists say they are, and they've never been disrupted, then you should be able to use a computer program to calculate backwards the date and the location of eclipses when they happened, historically. The problem is that if you go beyond that 750 BC boundary, suddenly the programs don't work anymore. You've got reliable observers telling us that there was an eclipse in a certain city on a certain day, and the computer program can't prove it.
Because of this here change in the, year.
Well, I ask, what except a change in the motion of the Earth or the Moon or could have caused that? That it's supposed to be clockwork. Mathematics should work. There shouldn't be anything except a change in motion that could cause the math not to work. Okay, now you've got some other interesting things. Back in the early centuries AD, Ptolemy did some observation of the planet Venus, and he recorded the times, its motions in the sky. Venus has periods of time where it's visible and then where it's not visible, and there's certain periods of time that we should be able to count on now based on its orbit. The numbers of days ought to be reasonably consistent. Well, he did observations that are wildly off from what we see today, and he also drew pictures of the phases of Venus. Venus has phases sort of like the moon does, where you see the crescent size change. Looks to us like
so it kind of waned.
Right, and so he drew pictures of those, and those are wildly different from what we see today also. But the problem is that if you go forward to 1500 AD, suddenly you have other observers at 1500 AD also making, recording these periods of time of Venus's orbit and drawing pictures of the phases of Venus. And those timings and those pictures don't agree with what we see today either, but they also don't agree with what Ptolemy said. So it looks, based on that, as if the orbit of Venus was going through a change.
Causing everybody to see different angles at different times.
Right, and it shouldn't. It should, if it's been like clockwork, we should be able to verify those timings and those drawings.
And even predict them for the future.
Right. So now there are all sorts of difficulties with the theory, and scientists will tell you that it's hogwash, that Velikovsky can't be right. But the problem is that I couldn't get anybody to pin down an actual fact to base that opinion on, one that holds up.
Okay, so you couldn't get anybody to come up with anything solid or concrete.
Right. I mean, when you say to an astronomer, give me one firm fact that insists that Venus has got to be 1 billion years old as opposed to a few thousand years old, and they can't come up with it. There isn't one. And there are lots of facts that make it look like it's younger than billions of years old. For example, they've confirmed the existence of basalt on the surface of Venus, that's a rock that forms from lava flows that takes about 1,000 years for basalt to form. But they haven't been able to confirm the existence of granite, which takes millions of years to form. There are other things like the magnetic field of Venus is very weak, And a magnetic field is something that as a planet forms, grows over time, and should get stronger as the planet gets older. But being a